Ever been in a relationship where one person always needed reassurance while the other needed space? What happens when the person who chases finally walks away and the one who runs starts to feel the loss? There's a critical moment when the roles reverse, and that moment can be emotionally chaotic. Let's talk about what happens when the anxious leave and the avoidant's worst time begins. The avoidant only realizes the depth of connection after the anxious partner leaves. In the dynamic between anxious and avoidant attachment styles, there's often an emotional tug of war. One person pulls for closeness, seeks constant reassurance, tries to fix every uncomfortable silence and miscommunication. The other, when faced with that intensity, retreats. They need space. They pull back. They become distant, not always out of malice, but because closeness feels suffocating. The more one reaches, the more the other retreats, and it creates this exhausting loop where both people feel misunderstood. But something unexpected happens when the anxious partner, worn out from carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, finally stops reaching. When they decide to let go, not out of manipulation, not to teach a lesson, but because they've hit their limit, the entire dynamic begins to shift. At first, the avoidant may feel relief. They may interpret the silence as peace. Finally, they're not being pressed with emotional demands. They may feel a temporary sense of freedom, mistaking the absence of communication for harmony. But this phase never lasts. Because what avoidants often fail to grasp is how deeply connected the anxious partner was to the relationship. While they were pulling away, the anxious partner was investing everything: time, energy, vulnerability. They were constantly trying to interpret mixed signals, make sense of inconsistency, and soothe their own fears without ever getting true reassurance. And when someone like that walks away, it's not casual. It's not impulsive. It's the result of countless emotional battles that no one else saw. And that's where the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar. A void, not just the absence of texts or calls, but the absence of emotional energy that was constantly directed at them. That attention, that concern, that relentless effort to hold the relationship together, it all disappears. And for the first time, they begin to experience the weight of what they've lost. They might not name it immediately. They might not call it love, but they feel it in the silence. They feel it in the spaces where someone used to care about them more than they cared for themselves. They feel it when there's no longer someone trying to understand their mood swings or patiently waiting through their emotional shutdowns. This is when the delayed realization kicks in. The depth of connection that once felt overwhelming now feels like a lifeline they no longer have access to. And it's often not about the fear of being alone. It's about the sudden awareness that they were loved in a way they didn't know how to receive at the time. The moments they dismissed, the conversations they avoided, the emotional investments they took for granted, all of it starts to replay in their mind. And instead of feeling comfort in distance, they begin to feel the sharp edge of regret. But this realization is never immediate. It's not loud. It creeps in slowly. A song reminds them of a car ride you shared. A familiar scent triggers a memory. They see something you would have loved and instinctively want to send it to you, only to remember they no longer can. In those quiet moments, the connection they once downplayed begins to echo louder than ever. They start to remember the soft parts of the relationship, the safety they didn't recognize, the loyalty they never had to ask for, and what they once viewed as emotional neediness, they now recognize as depth, care, and consistency. Emotional absence triggers a delayed panic in the avoidant. In a relationship where one person is constantly seeking closeness and the other is perpetually pushing it away, it creates an imbalance that neither person knows how to properly regulate. The anxious partner becomes hyper-aware of any shift in tone, distance in responses, or changes in routine. They feel every withdrawal, every hesitation, and they try to fix it before it becomes something unmanageable. The avoidant, however, is often unaware of the slow erosion that's happening on the other side. They view space as necessary, even healthy, and they believe that creating emotional distance helps them maintain control. What they don't realize is that with every pullback, they're thinning the thread that holds the relationship together. When the anxious partner finally detaches, something very specific happens in the emotional landscape of the avoidant. At first, there's quiet, a calm that feels like relief. They tell themselves the relationship must have settled, that things are finally balanced, that maybe all that tension and emotional need has passed. But this interpretation is only possible because they've mistaken absence for peace. They've grown so accustomed to the anxious partner's presence, to the emotional current always flowing toward them, that they don't immediately register what has shifted. They assume things are fine because the storm has gone silent. But that silence isn't calm, it's absence. And absence doesn't shout, it waits. Days might go by, sometimes weeks, and then it starts, subtly at first. A strange emptiness begins to settle in. That text they expected doesn't come. That usual check-in after a bad day never arrives. The space they once defended so fiercely becomes heavier. They scroll through their phone looking for something they didn't realize they depended on. They begin to notice the gaps, not just in communication, but in emotion. There's no one to mirror back understanding, no one to make sense of their moods, no one reaching into their emotional world and offering connection. This is when the delayed panic begins. Because avoidants don't typically panic when others are emotional. They panic when those emotions disappear. When the anxious partner is in pain or seeking answers, the avoidant feels cornered, like they're being asked to give something they haven't yet accessed in themselves. But when that emotional engagement stops entirely, it threatens the structure the avoidant unconsciously relied on. That structure was built on being desired, pursued, forgiven, and understood without having to give too much back. Now, that structure collapses, and with it comes confusion and fear. The avoidant may not even know how to name what they're feeling. They might describe it as restlessness or irritability. They might throw themselves into work, distractions, or casual flings, anything to avoid confronting the hollowness that's beginning to grow. But nothing seems to replace what was lost. Because what was lost wasn't just a person, it was a dynamic that shielded them from their own vulnerability. The anxious partner, in their pursuit of love, had been doing all the emotional heavy lifting. They were the ones holding space, reaching across the distance, bridging the emotional gap. Now that the bridge is gone, the avoidant is left standing on their own island, looking across an emotional expanse they never learned how to cross. And that's when the delayed panic deepens. Not because they suddenly want to be close, but because they realize they don't know how. The emotional safety net is gone, and they don't have the tools to rebuild it. All the things they once said they needed, space, freedom, independence, now feel empty without the emotional presence that made those things bearable. They feel the cost of their choices, not in dramatic heartbreak, but in the subtle, creeping awareness that they pushed away the very thing that made them feel connected. The anxious partner's silence becomes more powerful than their pleas ever were. In the early stages of a relationship where one person leans anxious and the other avoidant, there's usually a familiar pattern that forms. The anxious partner, deeply attuned to emotional shifts, is constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal. When they sense it, they don't shut down. They speak up, reach out, ask questions, and offer reassurance in hopes of receiving some back. Their way of protecting the relationship is through engagement, talking, texting, clarifying, repairing. They plead for understanding, not because they're trying to manipulate, but because they fear disconnection. But over time, that engagement becomes background noise to the avoidant. It's there every day, reliable, consistent, predictable, and like anything that's always available, it becomes easy to take for granted. The avoidant may even become irritated by it. They might label the anxious partner as needy or overly sensitive. They might roll their eyes at long messages or emotionally vulnerable conversations, not out of cruelty, but because they haven't made peace with their own need for closeness. What they don't realize in those moments is that the anxious partner is doing the work of two people, trying to keep the connection alive while managing their own emotional fears. It's not just communication they're offering, it's presence, it's care. It's the energy that keeps the relationship breathing. But when that energy is dismissed, ignored, or devalued repeatedly, something starts to shift inside the anxious partner. They stop trying. At first, the silence is quiet. It's not dramatic. It's not filled with ultimatums or big exits. It's subtle, shorter replies, fewer check-ins, less emotional availability. The anxious partner starts pulling their energy back, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. They've given so much, tried so hard, and reached so far that they no longer have anything left to offer. And this is where the real shift happens, because the same silence that might have once terrified the anxious partner becomes their protection. They stop asking to be heard. They stop trying to prove their worth. They step away from the exhausting pursuit of trying to feel chosen. And that silence? That's when the avoidant starts to feel something they've never felt before. When the emotional noise disappears, it creates space for awareness. The avoidant, used to being the one who needs space, suddenly finds themselves in a vacuum. The texts that once annoyed them are gone. The reassurances they brushed off aren't showing up. The person they always assumed would be there suddenly isn't. And what once felt overwhelming now feels eerily absent. It's not the presence of conflict that shakes them. It's the absence of connection. They might scroll through their messages expecting something to appear. They might reach out casually, only to be met with politeness instead of warmth. And in those moments, the silence speaks volumes. It says all the things the anxious partner tried to say through words. It says, "I'm done reaching." It says, "I've finally realized I deserve more." And more than anything, it communicates that their energy has shifted permanently, that they're no longer in emotional pursuit, that their silence isn't a tactic, it's a boundary. This kind of silence creates a tension the avoidant doesn't know how to sit with. It forces them to confront their own emotional discomfort without the buffer of someone else doing the work for them. They begin to replay all the times they dismissed the anxious partner's needs, all the moments they avoided intimacy, all the times they pulled away when they should have leaned in. They realize, often too late, that the very things they once found too much are now the things they long for. And the silence, the once quiet background hum of disconnection, now echoes louder than any words ever could. Avoidants often confuse control with love, until they lose both. In the framework of an avoidant attachment style, emotional closeness can feel threatening. The desire for autonomy is so strong that even simple moments of connection can be misinterpreted as pressure or obligation. When someone gets too close, the avoidant instinctively pulls back, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system registers intimacy as danger. To manage this discomfort, they begin to control the terms of the relationship, how close things get, how often communication happens, how much of their inner world they're willing to reveal. It's not always conscious. Many avoidants believe they're simply maintaining boundaries or protecting their peace. But underneath that, they're building an emotional wall that keeps them in control and keeps others at a distance. This sense of control becomes a kind of comfort zone. If the avoidant can dictate the rhythm of the relationship, they feel safe. They can show affection on their terms, give just enough to keep the connection alive, but not enough to feel vulnerable. The anxious partner, sensing the inconsistency, leans in harder. They become more expressive, more accommodating, more emotionally available in the hopes of breaking through that wall. But every time they do, the avoidant retreats further, mistaking their partner's emotional reach as an infringement on their freedom. And the more the anxious partner tries to close the gap, the more the avoidant relies on control as a defense mechanism. Control becomes the way they manage the discomfort of intimacy. They may delay responding to messages, avoid conversations about the future, or disappear for stretches of time. These behaviors aren't always malicious. They're rooted in fear, fear of being consumed, fear of not measuring up, fear of emotional dependency. Yet while the avoidant is trying to manage their inner world, the anxious partner is slowly losing theirs. They become drained from trying to earn love that feels conditional, from walking on eggshells, from shrinking themselves to keep the peace. And eventually, something inside them breaks. They stop asking for more. They stop chasing. They stop trying to prove they're enough. That's when the avoidant loses control, and it's the moment they finally start to confront the cost of the way they've been relating. What felt like power now feels like disconnection. The anxious partner, once fully engaged and emotionally invested, has stepped back. Their energy is no longer feeding the dynamic. The avoidant, so used to being the one who decides when and how things move forward, now finds themselves with no influence at all. They can't get the anxious partner to react, to fight, to plead. The silence is no longer theirs to give, it's theirs to receive. And this is where confusion begins to settle in. Because for the avoidant, love was always tied to control. As long as they could manage the flow of connection, they felt secure. But now that the anxious partner has removed themselves from that emotional current, the avoidant is forced to see what they've really built. A relationship rooted not in partnership, but in power dynamics. One where love was given conditionally and safety meant distance. Now, with no control left, they're faced with the emotional truth they spent so long avoiding. That love isn't about control, it's about connection. And the very thing they feared, true intimacy, was the thing slipping away each time they pulled back. Now that it's gone, they don't just feel the loss of the person. They feel the collapse of the illusion that control ever kept them safe in the first place. Healing for the anxious begins when chasing stops. Suffering for the avoidant begins when space becomes real. For the anxious partner, so much of the relationship revolves around the pursuit of connection. They monitor every shift in tone, analyze every pause in communication, and try to soothe the discomfort they feel when things feel uncertain. That constant chasing isn't always dramatic or loud. It's often subtle, expressed through check-ins, attempts to clarify, or a willingness to shrink themselves just to maintain harmony. This chase becomes a way of surviving in a relationship that never quite feels safe. The anxious partner gives more, hopes harder, and carries the emotional burden for both people. They apologize first, they forgive quickly, and they try again even when their needs go unmet, because they believe love is something to earn. But over time, something begins to shift. The anxiety doesn't disappear, but it transforms. The endless pursuit becomes too heavy to carry. The moments of silence stop feeling like opportunities to repair and start feeling like confirmation of a pattern that isn't going to change. There's a tipping point where the anxious partner stops trying, not because they no longer care, but because they've been running on empty for too long. And in that stillness, healing begins. It doesn't come all at once. It starts with discomfort, with resisting the urge to send the message, to reopen the conversation, to try one last time. It comes with sitting in the quiet and realizing that their worth was never meant to be proven through someone else's resistance. Healing shows up in the smallest of shifts. The anxious partner begins to focus on themselves, not in a performative way, but in a deeply intentional one. They start listening to their own voice again after so long being tuned into someone else's needs. They stop over-explaining, stop begging to be seen, and start reclaiming the energy they gave away so freely. The space that once felt like rejection begins to feel like room to breathe. They grieve not just the relationship, but the version of themselves who kept reaching. And slowly, they come back to life, not with bitterness, but with boundaries. While this transformation is unfolding for the anxious partner, something entirely different is happening for the avoidant. At first, they feel calm. The usual demands for connection have vanished. The anxious partner, who once filled every space with attention and emotional availability, has gone quiet. And for a brief moment, the avoidant confuses that silence with peace. They think they've gotten what they always wanted: space. No pressure, no emotional demands, no conversations that feel too deep or too exposing. But then the silence starts to echo. The familiar rhythms of the relationship are gone. There are no more check-ins, no more attempts to re-establish connection, no more emotional presence waiting for them to return. And what was once comforting space now feels like emptiness. The avoidant, who built their emotional safety around keeping people at arm's length, begins to feel the absence in a way they don't know how to process. They're no longer managing a relationship. They're sitting in the ruins of one. And this is where suffering begins. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone, not by choice, but by consequence. The anxious partner's retreat isn't a strategy. It's a surrender. The emotional current has stopped, and the avoidant is left with the stillness they thought they needed. But instead of feeling peace, they feel loss, real loss. Not because someone left them with angry words or slammed doors, but because someone left quietly, fully, and without looking back. The avoidant begins to realize that the space they fought so hard to protect is now the space where connection used to live. And in that space, for the first time, they start to feel everything they avoided.